Colombian workers sew their mouths shut in protest against General Motors. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. It was at the beginning of this month that a group of former GM workers sewed their mouths shut and began that hunger strike. They'd already spent over a year outside the US Embassy with no success in fighting against what they said was their unfair dismissal. The protesters say GM has fired more than 200 employees after they were injured at the company's Colombian plant. In addition, they say that the US car company refused to provide any compensation to the workers and erased medical records to bolster its legal case. GM, which has more than 1,800 employees in Colombia, denies the allegations and says it has never put the health of any employee at risk and not discharged anyone for health reasons. But the GM protest is focusing attention on workers' rights in Colombia following the implementation of a long-delayed free trade agreement with the US earlier this year. One of Washington's prerequisites for the passing of the agreement was the enacting of a labor action plan aimed at curtailing abuses of workers' rights. But critics say little has changed in a country regarded as the most dangerous in the world to be a member of a trade union. The violence goes on. In 2011, 29 trade unionists were murdered and 480 injured in violent attacks. Some argue, as in other countries, such free trade agreements result in worse conditions for workers. Here's an extract from a video released by the protesters as they began their hunger strike.
Hoy, 1 de agosto de 2012, iniciamos nuestra huelga permanente y definitiva de hambre con los labios cosidos. Nosotros somos la Asociación de Trabajadores y Extrabajadores Enfermos de General Motors. Por todo lo que hemos venido denunciando contra General Motors, por los atropellos que existen hacia sus trabajadores en Colombia.
Llevamos más de un año muriéndonos lentamente cada día frente a la Embajada de los Estados Unidos.
Prácticamente nos da lo mismo morirnos de hambre o morirnos esperando a que ellos nos solucionen esta problemática. Estamos decididos a llegar hasta las últimas consecuencias y bueno, que Dios nos acompañe y nos ayude. Amén.
So, are the rights of workers in Colombia being protected? Joining me from Bogota is Austin Robles from Witness for Peace International. He's been working with the GM protesters in Colombia. From Berkeley, David Bacon joins us. He's a journalist who specializes in international labor issues. And here in the studio, Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli. She's senior associate for the Andes region for the Washington office on Latin America and has also visited the protesters several times. Austin, first of all, then, can you update us on the physical condition of the strikers?
They're about to enter their fourth week on hunger strikes. They're extremely weak. One of the men was actually hospitalized this past weekend. And he was diagnosed with severe malnutrition and dehydration. He went through 10 bags of hydration liquid, 10-liter bags. The doctor told him that he was at risk of a heart attack if he continued the hunger strike. Their resolve has never been in question, even though their health is debilitating. He is going to continue the hunger strike, as are all of them. They've also been telling me that they're feeling increased pain because they're not able to sleep all that well. They have 4 to 6 stitches in their lips, and that pain hasn't gone away. Those wounds are still, they have not healed yet. They also have, most of them have undergone multiple surgeries. They're suffering from work-related injuries, and they can feel that pain a lot more now that they're not strengthened.
How many are currently on strike?
There are 7 of them. 4 of them started the hunger strike, and so their lips closed on August 1st. Another 3 joined on August 8th. So there are 7 with their lips sewn shut, and there are 6 others who have joined that are also in hunger strike that did not sew their lips up.
Why did they decide to go that extra and stitch their mouths up in addition to the hunger strike?
They've been in protest in front of the US Embassy for a little over a year now, and they did that for, one of the reasons they did that was to boost their profile, but they still haven't gotten the attention that they need, and they feel like without increased attention, nobody's going to pay notice to them. So they sewed their lips shut first for more attention. They also did it to symbolize what it means. GM said that there has refused to negotiate any sort of resolution with them, which means that since they're unable to find jobs elsewhere, they don't have money to support their families, and they're going to starve to death. So they said, instead of letting GM do that to us, we're going to go on hunger strike and starve ourselves to death. So it's just the physical representation of the choice that GM has given them.
All right. Well, GM does say that, as far as it's concerned, this issue isn't closed yet. We did contact General Motors for a comment. They said there's this statement: GM emphasizes a safety-first culture in all our facilities around the world. As one of the first companies to adopt the global Sullivan principles, we also have been recognized for the quality of working conditions that exist in all of our operations. That's why we are interested in learning more about the ongoing safety allegations of a few former GM Colmotores employees. A team of GM representatives, all of whom have deep experience spanning labor, manufacturing and management issues, traveled to Colombia to better understand and address the situation. Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli, what do you make of that?
Well, that's absolutely not true. There's this high-level delegation taking place, and they've met with the U.S. Embassy and they've met with others, but they haven't met with the workers, which is completely unacceptable. How are they doing an assessment of what's going on with the workers and trying to resolve the situation? They won't even speak to them.
I should actually quickly mention that the Global Sullivan Principles is a sort of corporate code of conduct that was sorted out with Kofi Annan and various corporations some time ago about equal rights and indeed health and safety and things like that. But there have been negotiations underway, haven't there, Gimena? How have they been understood? Yeah.
There have not been negotiations directly with the hunger strikers and those workers. There have been negotiations between GM at the corporate level and with the subsidiary, and there have been discussions, that kind of thing. But what happened about a week or so ago was that the ILO, the subsidiary company Colmotores, and the workers tried to have a negotiation, and Colmotores basically walked out of that negotiation. And so I don't really think that applies as a proper resolution.
What exactly are the workers demanding, Gimena?
They're demanding, first of all, to be legitimate in the sense of their claims, that there be an acceptance that there's been a problem, that they've been fired, that they either be reinstated or compensated for the situation they're in, and more broadly, that there be basically a broader debate about the labor standards at GM in Colombia.
Austin, what reason was given for their dismissal after they were injured?
They were terminated for different reasons. Some of them said that they weren't performing well enough, that they weren't meeting the expectations of the company. None of them were fired officially for their injuries, though that was the reason that most of the workers believed that they were fired.
Now, the cases of those who are currently on hunger strike have not gone to trial, but GM says 95% of cases that have gone to trial have been found in GM's favor. So, I mean, surely then they have the law on their side.
These guys don't have any money to afford lawyers, and these are processes that can take years. They don't even have the means to take the cases themselves, of course, if they wanted to.
But Gimena, what about this idea that, I mean, there's this allegation that various records and medical records in particular were used in these trials and they were tampered with. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, the workers basically alleged that there was tampering and falsification of records, which is partly why those decisions were made in the favor of GM. There's also been an investigation with the Ministry of Labor in Colombia that found truth in some of that. And so I think that what this really needs is an independent investigation to assess exactly was there corruption, was there falsification of papers, and more than anything, that there be an actual negotiation into these 13 cases.
Austin, at this point, though, do you have confidence in both the judiciary in Colombia and the Colombian government itself that their rights, even under Colombian law, will be upheld?
I find it doubtful. I mean, to give one example, Jorge Parra, who's the president of the association that's on strike, his medical records were changed, and his health insurance provider, Colpatria, was actually found guilty of changing his records to reflect his injuries as being common rather than occupational. So if he goes to court with that document, which is still the official document, he will lose his case.
All right, so then all of this is taking place, David, in the context of the Colombian, the newly minted and implemented Colombia Free Trade Agreement with the US. GM, of course, a US company, 60% shares owned by the US government, which of course is why the protesters are outside the US embassy. Actually, we'll just briefly go through some of the elements of the free trade agreement between the US and Colombia. It eliminates 80% of tariffs on trade between Colombia and the US immediately and phases out the rest over the next decade. Supporters say it will expand US product exports by more than $1 billion and create thousands of new jobs in the US and Colombia. Critics say Colombia's poorest could be hurt by the deal. Colombia's own agriculture ministry said the FTA will eliminate 35% of the country's agriculture jobs. They say it allows corporations to skirt environmental laws, which is of particular concern since the Amazonian rainforest makes up a third of the country. Another concern, Colombia's record of violence against union workers. Nearly 3,000 trade unionists have been killed in the last 25 years, but only 6% of those who have committed those crimes have faced prosecution. And the killings indeed go on. I think, Gimena, you were telling me that since the free trade agreement was signed,
since the US-Colombia Labor Action Plan in April 2011, there's been at least 34 trade unionists killed and over 484 have received death threats.
David Bacon, what are we to make of this then? We had all those assurances. We have this Labor Action Plan that was signed that was supposed to give lots of workers protection. And yet we have this particular dispute, not to mention the trade unionists still being killed.
Well, one reason why the workers who are involved in the hunger strike are doubtful about their chances for success in court is that out of those 3,000 people who have been murdered in Colombia because of their trade union activity, hardly anyone has ever stood trial for any of these murders, much less been punished. In fact, Colombian unions, together with U.S. unions, have gone into U.S. courts, in Florida, for instance, against Coca-Cola Corporation, trying to see if they couldn't find a way that the U.S. judicial system would take some action in protection of the rights of Colombian workers, since the Colombian courts and the Colombian judicial system has been so biased against workers and against unions. But let's look at what GM has done here, really. The accusation that there have been, even if the Colombian courts have not validated the claims, that there have been hundreds of people who have been injured in this plant, which only employs 1,800 people, means that General Motors essentially is running an unsafe plant. In other words, not investing in what it takes to run a safe assembly plant. That's not the record that GM has, for instance, in running the assembly plants that it has in the United States. GM is contesting the claims of these workers, essentially, again, as an effort to save money. And the Colombian government has, generally speaking, supported what General Motors is doing here, as witness the actions of the Colombian Labor Ministry in letting a year go by without even investigating the claims of these workers, essentially because the Colombian government's economic development policy is based on encouraging foreign investment. That's what the free trade agreement is really all about. It's encouraging foreign investment in Colombia and the use of Colombia as a market for foreign corporations. So workers who are injured are a cost. People who file compensation claims are a cost. Unions in Colombia are a cost because they push up wages. That's what lies behind the continuing terror campaigns which have resulted in the murders of so many people. So the Colombian Free Trade Agreement really comes on top of a set of policies that the Colombian government has been pursuing for many, 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 many years. And this has had a disastrous effect on workers, not just at General Motors, but in other companies too. At Coca-Cola and the Coca-Cola bottling plants, for instance, there have been documented cases in which paramilitaries have cooperated with the management of the bottling plants in the murder of trade unionists from Central. In fact, there are two trade unionists at the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Colombia who are now being charged, ironically, by the Colombian government with terrorism as a result of their union activity, based on the accusation of paramilitaries who have themselves committed
doesn't the
murders,
newly signed
and in
Labour
one
Action
case
Plan
even
to have some
kidnapped
effect
the
on
daughter
this?
of one of the trade unionists.
I think we were assured by President Obama that this was all going to change, and that's why they signed the free trade agreement.
Yes, the free trade agreement was
Well, the
upheld.
Colombian...
Dave, hang on a second. Yes, Gimena?
Sorry, the free trade agreement was upheld by the U.S. Congress for 5 years because of the concern of violence against trade unionists and impunity in those cases. Obama and Santos last year assured that they were doing this
Santos, the president.
President Santos, that they're doing this labor action plan because while they're giving multinationals this agreement, they want to guarantee that workers have their rights respected. However, what we've seen is that since this has happened, the situation and the promises of the labor action plan haven't been met. We've had continued trade union killings. We have continued to have an abysmal rate of justice in the trade unionist cases. The few cases where there has been some form of justice, it hasn't been the intellectual authors, but the perpetrators of the violence. In the direct
But is there no oversight?
contracts,
Is there no checking up that these measures are being met in order to continue this free
the
trade
Labor
agreement?
Ministry was just established several months ago, really. The labor inspectors that have been designated and are being paid for with support of U.S. funding are just getting up to speed. There's a large number of them, and there are lots of questions about whose side they're really on. And then we've seen that since Obama was in Cartagena in April, that not only has the Colombian government sort of taken a step back, thinking, okay, well, we got our trade agreement, we don't have to act very urgently to act on these cases, but there's been reprisals on almost all of the 5 sectors that are part of this labor action plan, including firings of at least 70 workers in the port industry. That was a major part of the labor action plan.
David Bacon, is this something unique to the Colombian free trade experience, or do we tend to see a similar problem with workers' rights and indeed problems with environmental issues and other things in other free trade agreements? And I mean, let's face it, President Obama has been very keen on them. He's signed quite a few with South Korea and Panama, for example. He's talking about one with various Southeast Asian nations. Is this something unique to Colombia?
No, it's not. In fact, the archetype for these trade agreements was the North American Free Trade Agreement. Again, that agreement was passed and signed with promises that it would protect labor rights. In fact, there was a separate side agreement that was designed supposedly to protect labor rights, and in fact, quite the opposite has taken place. Where workers, for instance, organize in the border factories along the U.S.-Mexico border to try to organize independent unions and raise their wages, they are routinely fired. Sometimes worse things than being fired happen to people. And there's been really no effective process put in place that would protect the rights of those workers. And the reason is really because the purpose of the agreements is not to protect workers' rights. The purpose of the agreement is to encourage foreign investment. And so you have a conflict of interest, you could say, between the desire of governments like the Colombian government or the Mexican government to encourage foreign investment by lowering costs, and a supposed purpose in these agreements, whether it's the side agreement under NAFTA or the labor action plan in the Colombian agreement, to protect workers' rights. Workers' rights wouldn't need protecting in this kind of way if these agreements weren't essentially placing such a premium on the encouragement of foreign investment and using things like low wages, the lack of unions.
But David, help me understand.
As a kind of a carrot.
As we mentioned before, even the Colombian government's own projections, actually, and the US projections for job creation showed actually probably a net loss after the signing of this free trade agreement. Why are they doing it?
That's right. Well, the purpose is not to create jobs. The purpose is to remove restrictions on investment and to allow U.S. corporations to get access to markets more easily. That has really a terrible impact on people. The record of wages in Mexico under NAFTA since 1994, wages for Mexican workers have gone down. Since 1994, when the agreement went into effect, over 7 million people from Mexico have come to live in the United States. We have 11% of the population of Mexico living here in the United States, in very large part because the net effect of NAFTA and the economic reforms that have gone along with it have been to lower people's income, to increase poverty, to essentially displace people and force people into a situation in which leaving home is really their only option to survive.
Actually, one of the ironies of that is it's usually politicians who are particularly hard, or take a particularly hard line on immigration, who are very gung-ho about these free trade agreements, even though perhaps it creates that kind of displacement. There's another thing, though. I mean, on this particular case, though, in Colombia, the role of the unions and international unions is quite interesting. You'd expect them to be joining together in international solidarity to try and counter some of this. But I just spoke to a former GM worker, a former United Auto Workers worker, who is organising protests in Detroit against GM on this topic. I asked him whether these workers in Colombia had the support of the United Auto Workers. Here's what he had to say.
The UAW is in support of the Colombian workers, and I'm hoping that they will issue a statement and actually get word to UAW rank and file members of what's going on in Colombia. I'm very happy to say that there are other unions that have come forward, including the United Steelworkers, and the AFL-CIO came out with a very strong statement as well. So I'm expecting in short order that, you know, the UAW will come out and support as well.
Because I know that you're organising strikes outside the GM building, but as far as you know, then the UAW isn't part of these yet, then?
This has been a strictly rank and file effort. We held a demonstration in front of the GM headquarters last week, and we intend to do that again this coming Friday. And as rank and file and retirees, we're hoping that UAW leadership will join us, yes.
What do you make about the allegation, though, that the current leadership has tended to break ranks with other trade unions, not only in the US but around the world, when it comes to free trade agreements and these sorts of, and indeed labour conditions in other countries other than the US?
The UAW was opposed to the Colombia Free Trade Agreement pretty much consistently with the other elements of the labor movement. I think our labor movement, including the UAW, could have done more to challenge the Free Trade Agreement, given our history with, for example, the Free Trade Agreement, the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. So I think it needed to step up to the plate. I think the whole labor movement needed to do that, and I think it might have been reluctant to do that because it wasn't George Bush that was doing it. It was Barack Obama.
But the UAW in particular, and Bob King, came out in favour of the South Korean Free Trade Agreement, even as the umbrella union group, the AFL-CIO and other unions, came out against it.
Yes, the UAW, in a very odd manner, inconsistent with its position on every other free trade agreement, actually went along with Korean free trade agreement with South Korea. And unfortunately, for whatever jobs that we are creating here in the UAW with GM and so on, we stand to lose many more as a result of that free trade agreement. So it was a bit of a contradiction for the UAW to have done that. Normally and consistently, they've opposed the free trade agreements.
Frank Hammer there. David Bacon, I mean, if you have a president who once spoke out against these free trade agreements, now passing them, and you have the unions not entirely all together on the issue, then what hope is there of resisting this push towards transnational superiority over national concerns and workers' rights and things like that?
Well, I think unions actually are probably one of the best hopes for solidarity and resisting the way in which these agreements are having their impact on workers, both here in the United States, where workers lose jobs, and also in other countries. The Steelworkers Union, for instance, has been the main support of trade unions in Colombia, including not just the workers at the Coca-Cola bottling plants, but workers at, for instance, the Drummond coal mines. You know, Drummond, a big U.S. corporation based in Alabama, has a mine in which workers were assassinated for their union participation, and Drummond takes the coal out of that mine and it ships it to Alabama, where it's burned by the Alabama Power
David, I'm going to have
Company.
to stop you there.
So unions see that relationship. They see the importance of supporting what workers do in other countries because it has an impact on what happens to workers here.
David Bacon, thank you very much. Austin Robles, thank you. Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli, thank you very much too. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the programme. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.